U.S. is perceived by its citizens as a flawless country that has never made a mistake. Although the U.S. has done its best to uphold this picture-perfect image, mistakes have been made, yet not admitted. One event where the U.S. ignored the inalienable rights granted by the Declaration of Independence was the Trail of Tears. There is much inaccuracy about this topic because history textbooks don't always provide us with historically accurate content, but the content they want us to hear. The Trail of Tears is the lowest point in U.S. history because the U.S. disregarded the fact that everyone has unalienable rights and ignored their duties of protecting American Indians.
As the U.S. grew, more and more people tried to settle in the Indians' territory. As you can imagine, the American Indians did not like this. In the year 1790, many American Indians resided along the southern U.S. The original borders for the U.S. and the Indians were the Appalachian Mountains, which provided a natural barrier from each other. 5 of the most prominent tribes at the time were the Seminole tribe in present-day Florida, the Choctaw and the Chickasaw in present-day Mississippi and Alabama, the Creek tribe in present-day Mississippi and southern Georgia, and the Cherokee Indians in Georgia.
In the year 1791, the Treaty of Holston was signed. This treaty had the Indians give up some land to establish new boundaries. It was the U.S.'s responsibility to pass and abide by the laws set forth by this treaty. The new boundaries separated Tennessee into Indian Territory and U.S. land. The U.S. would pay $1,000 annually for this land. The treaty also granted the Indians sovereignty, which means they had the right to federal power. This sovereignty guaranteed that the Indians had the right to unalienable rights because they were considered citizens of the Indian nation.
As the years went by, many more settlers began to break the treaty. One man, Zachariah Cox, sold American Indians land illegally, so he could gain money quickly. Due to all the Americans settling on Indian territory, the Treaty of Hopewell was put in place as a final effort to establish boundaries between American Indians and settlers. This gave a final set of boundaries that any Americans settling on Indian land would be removed, but the Americans quickly disregarded it.
In the year 1802, President Thomas Jefferson promised the state of Georgia he would remove the American Indians. Jefferson tried, but he could not succeed. It was not until Andrew Jackson came along that significant progress in Indian removal was made. Jackson grew up in a frontier town where stories of Indian attacks were common, and Jackson felt that it was his responsibility to remove the American Indians for the safety of the United States. From a very young age, Andrew Jackson learned to hate the Indians. When Andrew Jackson became president, he worked to make removal the best option available to the Cherokee.
On May 28, 1830, the Indian Removal Act became law. The Indian Removal Act forced Indians within the U.S. to leave their lands and settle west of the Mississippi. This law upset the American Indians greatly. There wasn't anything most of the Indians could do because no Indian army was capable of stopping the U.S., and nobody knew how to take the act to court to see if it was unconstitutional. So the American Indians simply waited until they were forcefully removed.
The first major tribe to go was the Choctaw. The leader of the Choctaw tribe, George W. Harkins, wrote a farewell letter to America explaining why Indian removal was wrong. The Choctaw left present-day Mississippi in November 1831. There was a lot of flooding, and the U.S. soldiers didn't bring enough food for the journey. When the Choctaws finally arrived in 1833, there were 2,500 to 5,000 dead American Indians. Those who hid from the removal were arrested, beaten, and their homes were burned.
When all was said and done, the Choctaw removal was responsible for $5 million. Andrew Jackson had predicted it would cost $3 million for all Indian removal. This outraged American taxpayers. Andrew Jackson pushed even harder for Indian removal afterwards. The American Indians, on the other hand, wanted to avoid horrific events like the Choctaw had experienced. In 1832, the Cherokee Indians fought removal legally. The Cherokee brought their case to the Supreme Court in what became known as Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. In this case, the Supreme Court ruled that the Cherokee were not an individual state and that Georgia controlled them. It would take years, but eventually the Cherokee Indians were granted the right to federal authority, but it all came down to President Jackson's opinion. March 24, 1832, the Creek Indians signed the Treaty of Cassetta. This treaty had the Creek Indians give up all their land east of the Mississippi River in return for land in present-day Oklahoma. Similar to the Choctaw, the Creek Indians faced many challenges in their journey west. Many Indians fell ill with dysentery, a disease from contaminated food and water, and died. Due to the fact that the U.S. had never seen this disease before, they were unable to treat it and many Indians died.
The Chickasaw, on the other hand, had been trying to sign a treaty for 7 years, but the U.S. constantly rejected them. It wasn't until 1837 that the Indians were finally able to sell their land for $3 million. Yet again, on the march west, hundreds of Indians died.
In 1837, the Cherokee Indians were the only major American Indian tribe remaining in the southern U.S. Even though the Supreme Court had ruled that the Cherokee had federal authority, Andrew Jackson was quoted by saying, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Many Cherokees stood their ground against Georgia, but a certain group of Cherokees disagreed with everybody else.
Wealthy Cherokees, known as the Cherokee middle class, known as the middle class because wealthy Cherokees were considered regular Americans, wanted to completely uproot Cherokee society so they could come to power. These men, Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, became known as the Treaty Party because they supported signing a treaty. While John Ross, the chief of the Cherokee Indians, was in Washington petitioning for Cherokees to stay, the Treaty Party signed the Treaty of New Echota on December 29, 1835. Even though John Ross presented a petition with over 20,000 signatures, the U.S. went on with removal.
On May 23, 1836, the Treaty of New Echota became law. The Treaty of New Echota said that the U.S. government would pay $5 million for the Cherokee land and give the Cherokees land in present-day Oklahoma. The treaty also gave the Cherokees 2 years to relocate voluntarily. Only about 2,500 Cherokee chose this option. Out of the remaining 16,000 Cherokees left, they were forced out beginning in 1838. The Cherokee were being relocated from northern Georgia to Oklahoma, a 1,000-mile march. Nobody could have predicted what the Cherokee Indians would go through on their journey to Oklahoma.
General Winfield Scott and his army of 7,000 soldiers rounded up the Cherokee at Bayonet Point. The Cherokee were allowed nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some Cherokee who had prepared for relocation took blankets as well. The Cherokee began their journey west during the summer of 1838. The heat was blistering. As many as 5 Cherokees died a day of exhaustion or illness. The U.S. soldiers soon realized their mistake and forced the Cherokee to wait in prison camps until wagons arrived.
In November of 1838, 600 wagons arrived with oxen, and the Indians were forced to travel west again. The November weather was very harsh, and the Cherokee were bombarded with blizzards and sleet. The conditions for the Cherokee were terrible. Most Indians had a lack of clothing and blankets. There was not enough room for everyone on the wagons. Many Indians slept on the frozen ground. Many parents gave their blankets to their freezing children, which resulted in many adult Indian deaths. Some American Indian mothers even went to the extreme of killing their children so they would not have to endure the terrible conditions.
The soldiers treated the Indians inhumanely during the Trail of Tears. Many Indians were shot on sight for burying their relatives. Elderly and ill Indians who could not climb over the wagons were beaten for slowing progress. Due to the terrible weather conditions and the cruelty of the U.S. soldiers, many Indians were dying. 12 to 22 Cherokee died of pneumonia each night. One of the victims of pneumonia was John Ross's wife. By the time the Cherokees had finally reached Oklahoma, 4,000 to 5,000 of the Cherokee had died. The event for the Cherokee became known as Nu Na Da Ol Sun Yi, which translates to the place where they cried.
The Trail of Tears represents how the U.S. abused its power to remove American Indians from their land. Even though the Cherokee Nation was granted certain rights by the U.S. Supreme Court, President Andrew Jackson and the state of Georgia ignored them and continued to take the Indians' land. The Cherokee Nation still exists in parts of Georgia today, and there is an annual 1,000-mile motorcycle ride from Georgia to Oklahoma in honor of the Cherokee who lost their lives along the Trail of Tears. It is our responsibility to honor and remember the American Indians who lost their lives because of the devastating journey that is the Trail of Tears.
Many may not know of the devastating effect that the Trail of Tears left on the Cherokee Nation and the pain and suffering that scarred the American Indians. The Trail of Tears will always be remembered as one of, if not the lowest point in U.S. history. The trail will forever act as a reminder of the strength, bravery, and perseverance of the American Indians that they kept until their final seconds.